The first politician I have is Senator Mark Warner. After reaching out to his office, I was put in touch with his Deputy Press Secretary, Laura Dacey, who supplied me with this video.
Hey, it's Mark Warner. The United States Senate tonight, for the first time in over 20 years, passed bipartisan, common sense gun safety law. For many of us, this bill didn't go far enough, but it is a step forward. It will save lives. And after 20 years of politicians doing nothing more than kind of sending thoughts and prayers, we actually have a bill, when the House passes and gets to the president, that will make sure on background checks, on mental health, on making sure we have got appropriate red flag laws, we're making some progress. The fight's not over, but tonight we took a meaningful step forward. Again, that will save lives.
On top of that, Senator Warner also created a written statement for me to use in the video, which I'll read now. Virginians know all too well the pain of gun violence. Pain no one should have to experience. Last year, we took the first meaningful step in over 2 decades to curb the violence that plagues our country with the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, but I know there is still significant work to do. While legislation will not prevent against every senseless act of gun violence in our country, we can and should take reasonable steps to make our communities safer. I then reached out to the office of Senator Ben Cardin and was put in touch with Press Secretary Sarita Williams, who supplied me with this statement. Ending gun violence is a critically important issue to Senator Cardin. Throughout his career, Senator Cardin has been a strong advocate for common-sense gun safety legislation like banning ghost guns and passing the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was signed into law last year and included first steps to prevent gun violence. When I reached out to Senator Chuck Grassley's office, I was put in touch with professional staff member Michael D. Perkins, who supplied me with this statement. As you may know, Senator Grassley has been a leading advocate to put into place school security measures and procedures to protect our children from future violence. For example, he is working to pass the EAGLES Act. This legislation would provide funding to support the Secret Service National Threat Assessment Center's efforts to conduct cutting-edge research into the prevention of violence. It would also enable the National Threat Assessment Center to train more of our nation's schools in conducting threat assessments and early interventions. Unfortunately, the legislation has stalled during the last 3 Congresses. While we have garnered more support for this bill, he is still profoundly frustrated by my colleagues who refuse to pledge their support. The EAGLES Act is a strong way to ensure schools across the nation are protected and that our children are safe from violent murderers. He reintroduced the EAGLES Act on February 14, 2023. In response to tragedies involving firearms, there are often calls to ban all guns, to ban the specific type of weapon that was used in the most recent shooting, or to ban so-called assault weapons. Such bans would be unconstitutional or ineffective. In 2008, the Supreme Court recognized in District of Columbia v. Heller that the Second Amendment of the Constitution protects an individual's right to keep and bear arms for lawful purposes such as self-defense and recreation, so an outright ban on guns is clearly unconstitutional. And in the more recent New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Inc. v. Bruin, the court held that the Second and 14th Amendment protect an individual's right to carry a handgun for self-defense outside the home. Additionally, in 2004, a Department of Justice study concluded that, after a 10-year assault weapons ban, there was no statistically significant evidence that banning assault weapons reduced gun murders. And the guns used in recent mass shootings have features that are common to many different models of guns, so banning a specific type of gun would not prevent future shootings. Senator Grassley believes the best way to prevent shootings is to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous individuals who should not possess them, not to restrict the constitutional rights of law-abiding Americans. Research shows that the failure to incapacitate repeat criminal offenders is the biggest factor in the gun violence problem in our nation. Rafael Mangual, the Nick O'Neill Fellow and Head of Research for the Policing and Public Safety Initiative from the Manhattan Institute, illustrated this point during a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on March 15, 2023. In his remarks, Mr. Mangual cited a study conducted by the University of Chicago Crime Lab. The study found that those arrested for a shooting or homicide in the city of Chicago in 2015 and 2016 had 12 prior arrests, and that nearly 1 in 5 had more than 20 prior arrests. Moreover, Washington, D.C. Metro Police Chief Robert Conti has observed a similar pattern in his jurisdiction. While speaking to the press on March 6, 2023, Chief Conti said that the average homicide suspect has been arrested 11 times prior to them committing a homicide. The senator wants you to know that he will continue to foster discussions on preventative measures we can take to prevent criminals from harming innocent civilians. One of the ways to do that is to evaluate and improve upon our current background check system, the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. He supported and pushed for the inclusion of the Fix NICS Act of 2017 into the Omnibus Spending Bill to fund the federal government, which was signed into law by President Trump in March of 2018. The Fix NICS Act of 2017 penalizes federal agencies who fail to comply with current law requiring them to properly report dangerous individuals and violent criminals to NICS, in addition to providing incentives to states to improve their overall criminal history reporting. Senator Grassley has been attempting to address the issues with NICS for some time now. For example, following the tragedy in Newtown, Connecticut in 2013, he introduced an amendment to address outstanding issues with NICS to gun legislation that was being considered by the full Senate. Despite garnering support of more than half of my colleagues at that time, my friends from across the aisle blocked this legislation. He then reintroduced this measure, known as the Protecting Communities and Preserving the Second Amendment Act of 2021, with Senators Cruz and Tillis during the 117th Congress. This legislation would reauthorize and improve NICS, increase resources for prosecutions of gun crime, address mental illness in the criminal justice system, and strengthen criminal law by including straw purchasing and illegal firearm trafficking statutes. Specifically, the Protecting Communities and Preserving the Second Amendment Act addresses violent crime committed with firearms in a number of ways. First, it would fix problems with NICS with a focus on improving the availability of records to the NICS database, including mental health records from federal and state courts that are currently not reported to the NICS system. These records include those of individuals who lack the mental capacity to stand trial or were found not guilty by reason of mental defect. Further, this bill would ensure that states provide records to the NICS system by penalizing those who fail to provide records. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office recognizes that this failure is a problem with the current NICS system. Additionally, my legislation would codify the executive order issued by President Obama requiring the federal agencies to submit relevant federal records to the database and report to Congress whether they are complying with the law. Together, these changes would strengthen the existing background check system. You may also be interested to know that during the 115th Congress, when he was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee and could set the agenda, he led 4 important efforts to help protect Americans from future acts of violence, 2 of which were signed into law. The first was the Students, Teachers, and Officers Preventing School Violence Act, which provides funding to schools to strengthen their infrastructure, which will make it harder for shooters to enter schools. The second was the School Safety and Mental Health Services Act. Senator Grassley, along with 13 other senators, introduced this bill, which would allow 100,000 public schools the opportunity to improve their safety measures by using federal dollars for school counselors, alarm systems, security cameras, and crisis intervention training. I also had the pleasure of getting in touch with Governor Greg Gianforte, who gave me this statement for the video project. As the parents of a school teacher and grandparents to little ones, Susan and I are heartbroken for families and communities torn apart by mass shootings at schools. All children and teachers should be able to go to school without fear. To protect our schools, I signed a law establishing a school marshal program in Montana in 2021. Instead of restricting the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Montanans, we ought to make schools safer and ensure young people who may be struggling with isolation, trouble at home, or mental health challenges have the support they need. We invested over $2 million to increase access to voluntary universal mental health screening in our schools to reduce the stigma associated with mental illness and get young Montanans the help they need. Another politician I reached out to was Governor Tim Walz, whose public engagement department gave me this statement. Governor Tim Walz and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flanagan want Minnesota to be a safe place for everyone. They have listened closely to Minnesotans across the state, from responsible gun owners to students to neighbors, and are proud to have signed into law common sense, broadly supported gun safety legislation during the 2023 legislative session. These measures include extreme risk protection orders. This policy allows a family or household member, guardian, chief law enforcement officer, city attorney, or county attorney to petition a court for relief via an extreme risk protection order if they believe that an individual possesses a significant danger of bodily harm to self or others, or is at significant risk of suicide by possessing a firearm. There are a variety of details necessary in order for a petition to be considered complete. If granted by the court, the individual may be prohibited from possessing a firearm for up to 1 year, subject to renewal or extension. This policy is effective on January 1st, 2024. Background checks. This policy expands background checks provisions in statute to private party transfers of pistols and semi-automatic military-style assault weapons through either a federally licensed firearms dealer or the transferee permitting process. Both parties must retain a copy of the record or transfer for up to 10 years. There are a number of exclusions to this requirement, including, but not limited to, a private party transfer between immediate family members, spouses, parents, children, siblings, or grandparents. This policy was effective August 1st, 2023. The governor and lieutenant governor are committed to continuing to bring people to the table to make sure that all Minnesotans can help prevent gun violence in Minnesota. When I reached out to Congressman Donald Bayer's office, I was put in touch with his Director of Operations, Christopher Wynn. He supplied me with a link to Representative Bayer's website where he had this statement. Gun violence claims over 30,000 lives per year, including nearly 20,000 firearm-related suicides. Despite this epidemic, Congress has sadly failed for years to take basic steps to curb gun violence despite overwhelming support for such measures by Americans from all political backgrounds. It is a major priority for me to enact laws requiring a background check on every gun sale in order to help keep guns out of the hands of those like to use them to commit crimes. I also support enacting restrictions on weapons designed for the battlefield, which are so often used in the mass shootings that have claimed so many lives in schools, churches, hospitals, theaters, malls, and so on. I have also championed extreme risk protection order laws, also known as red flag laws, which empower family members and law enforcement to petition a judge for a warrant to remove guns from those who demonstrate a serious threat to themselves or others. None of these measures by themselves would completely end gun violence in America, but studies suggest that each of them has the power to save many lives. I will continue to push for these and other gun reforms in the House of Representatives. When I reached out to Representative Jared Huffman, I was put in touch with his district scheduler and office manager, Alexia Byers, who gave me this written statement of his. Congress must enact comprehensive and common sense legislation to address the gun violence epidemic in this country. Too many people have lost their lives in this country to senseless, heartbreaking acts of gun violence. Since 2020, gun violence has been the leading cause of death for children and teenagers. I am committed to doing everything in my power to address the gun violence epidemic. Thoughts and prayers are not enough. Congress must act. As a member of the Gun Violence Prevention Task Force, I have supported common sense gun reforms throughout my time in Congress. I have been an original co-sponsor of legislation to ban the purchase of military-style assault weapons in each session of Congress since I took office. This Congress, I am an original co-sponsor of H.R. 698, the assault weapons ban of 2023. This bill would ban the sale, importation, manufacture, and transfer of assault weapons, bringing federal law in line with California's common sense approach to preventing gun violence. Additionally, I am a co-sponsor of H.R. 4184, the Equal Access to Justice for Victims of Gun Violence Act, which would end the firearm industry's immunity against civil suits and ensure they can be held accountable for negligence. I have also long supported expanding background checks for firearm purchases. I am an original co-sponsor of H.R. 715, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, which would expand background checks to cover all gun sales, as well as H.R. 2403, the Enhanced Background Checks Act, which would close the Charleston loophole, which allowed a gunman to kill 9 people at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. In the 117th Congress, I voted to pass S. 2938, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which incentivizes states to implement extreme risk protection order laws, strengthens background checks for buyers under 21, and provides funding for community-based violence prevention. President Joe Biden signed this historic legislation into law in June 2022, the first major gun reforms to be enacted in 30 years. I have also supported several additional bills to address the gun violence epidemic. I was an original co-sponsor of H.R. 1454, the Ghost Guns Are Guns Act, as well as H.R. 3088, the Untraceable Firearms Act, both of which would close the loophole that allows purchasers to evade federal background checks by buying unassembled, untraceable firearm kits online. These bills have not yet been reintroduced in the 118th Congress, and I look forward to reviewing them upon reintroduction. I also reached out to Representative Mike Levin, and I received a written statement from his legislative assistant, Allison Feinswag, which read, Representative Levin absolutely agrees we must do more to protect our families and children from gun violence. That is why Representative Levin was proud to help pass legislation such as the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first major federal gun violence prevention legislation in nearly 30 years. This bill will fund states' red flag laws, close the boyfriend loophole to prevent domestic abusers from possessing guns, strengthen background checks for buyers under age 21, crack down on gun trafficking and straw purchasing, fund community-based violence intervention programs, invest in mental health services, and fund school safety efforts. This bill specifically includes more funding for increased safety measures and training for school personnel and students. While this progress is important, we must absolutely do more. Representative Levin was also proud to support the Bipartisan Background Checks Act, which would institute universal background checks on all gun sales and most gun transfers. Further, we must ensure military-style assault weapons never end up in the hands of criminals. The congressman supports the Assault Weapons Ban Act, which would cut off the supply of new assault weapons that have been the weapon most used in our country's deadliest mass shootings. When I reached out to the office of Representative Seth Moulton, I was put in touch with Scheduler Assistant Gaya Gupta, who sent me this written statement from Representative Moulton. Like every American, I am devastated and infuriated by the constant barrage of gun violence in America. I read the news of another 18 murdered with a heavy heart, and I have been deeply disturbed in the days since by reports that the police knew about the shooter's threats of violence and did not act. I appreciate you reaching out to me in the wake of this terrible attack. I share your belief that if we truly want to honor the lives of those we lost, Congress must take meaningful action to prevent another tragedy. Right now, Congress isn't doing enough, not even close. A decade after the Sandy Hook massacre, gun violence is now the #1 cause of child death in the U.S. Every day, more than 110 people are killed by guns. This uniquely American epidemic of gun violence is directly tied to government inaction on gun laws. For years now, I have co-sponsored the assault weapons ban, which would make it a crime to import, sell, manufacture, transfer, or possess a semi-automatic assault weapon or large-capacity ammunition feeding device. This bill passed the House last year under a Democratic majority, but it got stuck in the Senate because of Republican opposition and the existence of the filibuster. I am as frustrated as you that, after all these senseless deaths, we still cannot pass this basic legislation. American lives, children's lives, are depending on it. I will continue to support this legislation wherever and however I can as I work to convince my Republican colleagues to have the political courage to do what most of them know is right. Beyond an assault weapons ban, I would also like to share what other legislation I have backed in Congress. First, we need violent history checks on every gun sale, which is supported by 86% of gun owners. In the 117th Congress, I was a co-sponsor of H.R. 8, a bill that would close loopholes in gun purchases and require violent history checks for all gun sales. The bill passed the House, but languished in the Senate for over a year. In that time, tens of thousands of people were killed by guns in America. This Congress, I am an original co-sponsor of the Enhanced Background Checks Act, which revises the amount of time a licensed gun dealer has to perform a background check from 3 days to 10 days, and the Federal Firearm Licensee Act. This bill would, among other provisions, expand federal firearms licensee laws to facilitators of firearms sales, like sellers at gun shows and online marketplaces, which are currently exempt from background check requirements and other federal regulations. In addition to background checks, we must consider other ways to keep guns and ammunition out of the hands of people who are likely to misuse them. To that end, I co-sponsored the Disarm Hate Act, which would bar people convicted of a misdemeanor hate crime from buying or otherwise receiving guns. I also co-sponsor Ethan's Law, which would create federal standards for the safe storage of firearms. More than 75% of firearms used in youth suicide attempts or accidental firearm injuries come from the homes of family or close friends. To protect our children, we must ensure that they cannot access guns unsupervised. Moreover, I am an original co-sponsor of the Stop Online Ammunition Sales Act, which would require federally licensed ammunition dealers to confirm the identity of individuals purchasing ammunition online via photo ID and require ammunition vendors to report any sales of more than 1,000 rounds within 5 consecutive days to the U.S. Attorney General. In June of 2022, the House voted to pass the Protecting Our Kids Act, of which I was a co-sponsor. This legislation would raise the minimum age for sales of certain semi-automatic guns from 18 to 21, set federal requirements for firearm storage, and ban the sale of large-capacity magazines. We also passed a bill to create a federal Extreme Risk Protection Order law. ERPOs allow courts to temporarily remove firearms from someone declared by a judge based on evidence presented by multiple parties and testimony from the defendant, to be an imminent threat to personal or public safety. In the months leading up to a mass shooting, 80% of perpetrators are in noticeable crisis and 44% leak plans of their attack. Law enforcement must be allowed to act on these warning signs to prevent shootings from occurring. Once again, the Senate failed to act on these bills. Frustrating as that is, we did take a critical step forward with the passage of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was signed into law on June 25, 2022. This legislation allocates $750 million of funding to be given to states for the creation and administration of mental health courts, drug courts, veterans courts, extreme risk protection orders, and legislation aiming to keep firearms out of the hands of people who are dangers to themselves or others. Adds convicted domestic violence abusers in dating relationships to the National Instant Criminal Background Check system, and creates a process for removal from NICS 5 years after the completion of the sentence if no other prohibited crimes are committed. Cracks down on gun dealers who illegally evade licensing requirements and clarifies which sellers need to register, conduct background checks, and keep appropriate records. Requires an investigative period of up to 10 days to review juvenile and mental health records, including checks with state databases and local law enforcement for buyers under 21 years of age. Creates federal straw purchasing and trafficking criminal offenses, allowing prosecutors to target dangerous illegal gun runners. Provides $250 million in funding for community and school-based violence prevention and mental health initiatives. Though this is good news, we still obviously have a ways to go if we want to end the epidemic of gun violence. That is why, in addition to supporting the bills outlined above, I also introduced the Mass Shooter Prosecution Act in July 2022 and have reintroduced it again this year. Mass shootings are nothing short of terrorism. The media, the general public, even the president call them that. But we don't currently prosecute mass shootings like the terrorist attacks they are because there are no legal grounds to do so. To rectify this issue, the MSPA would create a new terror statute that would make mass shootings a prosecutable terrorist offense. It would also enable law enforcement to carry out a comprehensive investigation of a mass shooter's network in the wake of a shooting and give them the authority to prosecute individuals who knowingly provided material support to the mass shooter. This measure would give law enforcement the tools necessary to prevent future violence by uncovering terrorist networks before they have time to plan their next attack. Further, The bill stipulates that a mass shooting is an act of terrorism only if it results in at least 3 fatalities and if the shooter uses a semi-automatic rifle or fully automatic weapon. These and other measures would ensure that the statute is not misused by law enforcement to target historically over-policed communities. The mass shooters in Buffalo, Uvalde, Nashville, and Lewiston won't be tried as terrorists despite taking dozens of innocent lives. If passed, the MSPA would ensure that the next mass shooter will be. Lastly, I requested significant funding for gun violence prevention and research through the fiscal year 2024 appropriations process. This included $60 million for gun violence research, $200 million for the Community Violence Intervention and Prevention Initiative, and $250 million for the CDC Community and Youth Violence Prevention Program. I also requested that the appropriations bill make Victims of Crime Act funding available for gun violence victim services programs. Gun violence is undeniably a public health crisis. We need to come together to finally achieve meaningful solutions, not just share platitudes of thoughts and prayers. Thank you again for writing to me about the assault weapons ban. I hear your fear and your anger, and I am fully committed to making this ban a reality. I also reached out to Congressman Bruce Westerman, who gave me the following written statement. The tragedies in recent years are horrid and should never have been allowed to happen. To fight for real solutions to the problem of violence in our country, I co-sponsored Stop 2, the Secure Every School and Protect Our Nation's Children Act. This bill would fund school resource officers and mental health counselors, close gaps in school security, and strengthen active shooter preparedness efforts, with all costs being offset with already approved but unused COVID-19 funds. We must address the root causes of these tragedies by identifying dangerous individuals, ensuring the proper enforcement of gun laws, and guaranteeing our most vulnerable are not left defenseless.